This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Joe Yule. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, and we wanted to come to your ears a little earlier this month with a very special bonus episode to celebrate World Localisation Day. Now, you may recall in episode 4 we caught up with Local Future's author Helena Norberg-Hodge, who also created the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness, to talk about food production. Helena champions localization for so many reasons, but one of her main motivations is the fact our global food system is the most polluting on Earth, accounting for 50% of global emissions. Not only that, but also the amount of waste created by this system makes it inefficient and in the long term completely unsustainable. Last time I caught up with Helena, we talked about the way countries import the same products that they export. For example, the States import 1.4 million tonnes of beef a year, but they also export the same amount. Or take the UK, who export 270 million litres of milk and import 170 million, which is insane. Especially when you consider that aside from the physical length and breadth of the planet our food travels to arrive within arm's reach, it often also flies or is shipped a long way to be processed. For example, 1/2 of Alaskan seafood is processed in China, then taken straight back to the States to supermarket shelves. Argentinian pears are shipped to Thailand to be packed, then taken back to the States for sale. And these commercial ships, with all this cargo on board, produce over 1 million tonnes of CO2 every single day. And air freight is even worse. So when you look at these through the lens of localization, the biggest question of all remains that when the climate crisis is reaching the depths of despair, is why is all this transportation needed when people could consume food exactly where it's produced? So as we warm up for not just a jam-packed 2 weeks of events in the World Localisation Day calendar and a smorgasbord of local feasting events across 6 continents in 20 countries, we ask the very inspiration behind all of this, Helena Norberg-Hodge, to join us and give us a little taster of what is coming up this month and why we should all think about getting on board. Helena, welcome to today's Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So I wanted to actually just kick off with a little event that unfolded since we last spoke in March. And that was the lodging of the Ever Given cargo boat in the Suez Canal, a 1,300-foot-long container ship travelling through the canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea and provides the shortest sea link between Asia and Europe, and caused a 422-ship tailback. And it has more than 12% of global trade passing through there. And that for me really shone a light globally on the sheer quantity of material being held up. And it kind of put into perspective what it really means when we order something online and then expect it to magically appear on our doorstep or a few days or even a week later. What did you think when you saw that news, Helena?
Well, I was really hoping it would help with this big wake up that we need. And I think it helped, but we need more women like you and me to keep hammering on about this, because we're in the grips of a leadership, very male-dominated, as we know, that just remains blind to these clear signs that we should be turning in the opposite direction. And the opposite direction is to turn away from a dependence on global trade that has been increasing literally since the beginnings of the modern economy, which started out with force, enclosures and slavery, driving regions, communities, even whole countries away from greater self-reliance, producing a range of things for themselves, to produce for a global market, meaning to produce for global traders. And we've kept on that track now for generations. And it's been accelerating, particularly in the last 30, 40 years. And right now, you might have heard about the trade negotiations between Australia and Great Britain. And it's all the time systematically destroying our ability to feed ourselves in a healthy, sustainable way. It's driving up emissions massively, climate damaging emissions, but also, of course, methane because of the big factories that are all part of this global food system, driving up the mountains of plastic that are, as you know now, turning into microscopic particles in the sea that are killing whales and dolphins. It's just tragic that we're on this trade-based track. And what's so heartening is that from the bottom up at the grassroots, there's this emerging localization movement. And that's what we're trying to raise awareness about and trying to strengthen worldwide.
It kind of reminded me, the damage that we saw being done there in the Suez Canal, that, of the kind of seaspiracy. I don't know if you saw that Netflix documentary that just came out recently, and the kind of, dredging up of the seabed and all of the damage that you just described, really, that this kind of, huge cargo ships caused to climate change.
Yeah, well, the tragedy about seaspiracy and cowspiracy, both of which reached quite wide audiences, is that they don't raise awareness about the alternative, not being that we should completely stop eating fish or stop eating meat, but the alternative is to support those decentralized, localized, diversified, smaller scale food economies. The trawlers that are used now have nets that can hold, more than a jumbo jet worth of fish. And these trawling nets just take everything out of the sea. But I'm sure that, I didn't see the film, but I'm sure that's what they showed. But did they explain that if we allowed many, many more jobs to survive across the planet, with smaller fishing boats, with people who use their eyes and their intelligence to throw back into the sea fish that are too small and that don't use toxic fish farming, and the same on the land, is that the smaller scale diversified systems with people instead of machines are the way that we can not only increase productivity, in other words, get more out of every bit of lake and ocean, get more out of every bit of land, while reducing the damage. We can literally increase productivity while healing ecosystems. That is a fact about more localized food economies, and that's what we have to keep driving home all the time.
I'm so glad that you answered that question and put that into perspective, because actually that was exactly what our last episode was about, this idea of the local fisheries and the no-take zones and the marine reserves and these artisan fish boats that are, that are out there doing what they've been doing for, hundreds and hundreds of years here. So I'm glad you said that. And I think if we're supplying jobs and we're preserving traditions and we're keeping, as you said, this possibility that, the bycatch can be put back and the local area is respected and regarded by the people that are doing that work, then I don't think it's as simple as let's not eat fish. So I'm glad that you addressed that. I think, when it comes to food that, could have been caught up on this ship that we just talked about, or just food in general that travels millions and millions of miles to our supermarkets, there are a few points. First off, it's likely that the food supply came from potentially industrialized agriculture that feeds corporate profits, but also this food has probably been sprayed with pesticides and almost has no nutritional value by the time it arrives on our plates or on our shelves. So how and why does this system continue at pace? And how can we make local food even more affordable for local people to consume?
It is continuing because our governments, and I'm afraid that this is true of virtually every government, including my native country of Sweden, America, Spain, are locked into a blind metric of growth. It's measured by GDP, which is the most absurd and criminal way of measuring progress. It literally is a measure of commercialization, and that means it's a measure of destruction. Literally, if in a given population, everyone falls ill, and right now we're seeing a lot of illness, and it's all very lucrative. If people fall ill, it adds to GDP. If we were to all stay healthy, that would be a rather unpatriotic thing to do because GDP would go down. It is literally that simple. If we plant a garden instead of buying our food, GDP goes down. So eating fresh food from your garden, staying healthy, is reducing this indicator of progress. It's just absolutely criminal. And I think a 5-year-old child would realize what is going on here. If the water is so polluted, we have to buy it in bottles. Fabulous for GDP. And the great food swap, the trade swap that's going on around the world is all linked to this mad measure. And that means that governments are increasing the limited funds they have, because they're getting poorer and poorer, to build up a global infrastructure to increase global trade. They are deregulating global trade while they are over-regulating every local individual business, everything that's place-based. So if you're operating in Ibiza in Spain, or if you're operating in Sweden, your government is there policing you. Even if you want to build a staircase inside your house, you have people coming to measure how high those steps are and telling you how to build them. In the meanwhile, they are removing regulations for giant global corporations to fly food across the world to be processed, to just send shrimp from England to Thailand to be peeled, to send fish from Norway to China to be deboned, send apples to be washed and flown back again. That is being completely deregulated and supported with our taxes. So we have really an insane and just tragic structure now where the global players, be they banks, be they fisher industries, be they agribusinesses, seed businesses, pharmaceuticals, have these unbelievably favorable conditions to amass wealth for fewer and fewer people while they are destroying the biosphere, and with it, destroying jobs. In the meanwhile, as people are squeezed with regulations and taxes, more and more people get fed up with government. And so they're saying, let's have laissez-faire economics. I'm going to vote for those leaders who tell me that it doesn't matter about climate, doesn't matter about the Amazon. We've got to grow the economy. So they fall into the trap of supporting this growth-based system that is actually making them poorer. So, it's the big picture that can save us. And it's going to need podcasts like yours. It's going to need more attempts from the bottom up, from common sense, to try to get the truth out about what's happening. So for me, what I see also is that when you go higher up to levels of power in governments or in business, the higher up the ladder you go, the blinder people are. And of course, it's fundamentally patriarchal, but we have quite a lot of women CEOs now. We have some women prime ministers, and it really doesn't matter what the gender is or the culture. At the top of those ladders, people are not just blind, but they are so short of time that they cannot do anything but relate to numbers and abstract concepts. They are protected from witnessing the real damaging effect on people's health, on their jobs, on their democracy, on the soil. We're talking about this food industry that provides food that has no nutrition. Well, it's also destroying the soil. So the soil has no life, and it creates deserts and destroys the opportunities to grow food. And then many leaders will happily support the need for new technology. We've got to have genetic engineering. We've got to have vertical high-rise agriculture funded with multiple subsidies to try to produce food for the world. It's an insanity, but it's an insanity born of blindness, I think, more than ill will. And that's why I still have some hope that we could, in this very, very late stage of our mad economy, suddenly have a big wake up that would help us steer in a direction that is so commonsensical and that is so it makes sense, and it's also being demonstrated through small initiatives around the world. So it's not just a theory that's supporting local economies around the world, which allows local knowledge, place-based knowledge to allow for, and not only allow for, but demand the care that comes out of actually seeing, experiencing the impact that you're having on the soil, on the trees, on the water. And that experiential knowledge is the foundation not only of greater wisdom and care, but it's also a foundation for being in touch with the fact that the only economy is the living earth. That is where everything we need comes from. So we must come back to recognizing that. We must move away from this haze, this absolute fog of numbers and concepts that are making, our leaders more and more mad, and that, the general public, which doesn't really look at these issues, tends to go along with these assumptions. And so big picture activism is what I plead for, looking at that bigger picture.
Thank you, Helena. And yeah, I really liked what you were saying on your own podcast, actually, Local Bites, about that exact big picture, as you said, because one of your co-presenters came up with this wonderful phrase, "We are prisoners of context in the absence of meaning." And you said, it's our job to provide that bigger picture and to put that meaning into context and to come back with the bigger picture. It's our job to kind of provide more insight into the way that really looks.
And what I do see is that around the world, especially women are the leaders in the on-the-ground work that's needed to start rebuilding the community fabric, the local economies, the deeper reconnection to life. That is what we need for our health, our physical health, for our spiritual health, for our well-being on every level. So it's happening, but what we need to add to that is also a look at this world of abstractions and this, if you like, patriarchal economic system that has been developing over several generations. And that's where I think when those two pictures come together, that's when everything falls into place. And it just makes so much sense that we need to rebuild that community fabric and local economic structure worldwide.
There does seem to be a real wave of women kind of, really shining a light on these issues. I mean, this kind of podcast is, looking at these issues through the lens of ecofeminism. And it feels people like obviously Vandana Shiva, who is obviously a big part of your Local Futures project and World Localization idea. And I think, it's incredibly important, really, that these women do have a voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we want to keep this in, but between you and me, it's unfortunate there just aren't that many women who are looking at that bigger picture. And so the voice of the women tends to come from that deeper knowing, that embodied knowing that's vital, but it doesn't help us question the dominant path.
And, you talked about the soil obviously being one of the crucial factors in healing the planet and sort of, rescuing this whole kind of globalized situation or offsetting it perhaps. And obviously through localization, even smallholder farms being home to 95% of the world's agro biodiversity. But I was very interested in what you were saying in the Local Bites podcast also about this idea of regenerative agriculture, which, is a real kind of buzzword, if you like, at the moment. It kind of seems to be a real trend that everyone's sort of talking about and leading towards. But I feel like you had slightly different views on it. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry. I just feel like I'm such a party pooper or something, but I'm just warning of picking up terms that have come on the scene very quickly and have spread globally almost overnight, so that now many small agroecological, permaculture, biodynamic, organic farms, now people are calling themselves regenerative, and they don't realize that they're giving an alibi to Nestle that's also calling itself regen. So we need to be very alert, we need to be very holistic, so that once we understand the problem with allowing giant corporations and businesses to engage in this insane trade of literally importing and exporting the same food stuff, reducing biodiversity as we speak. We're extinguishing a wealth of biodiversity, much of which hasn't even been sort of documented yet, because the real banks, the real seed banks, are the farmers who keep growing foods. We're talking here particularly about agricultural biodiversity, but we have to remember also that the global food system in its totality, because it contributes to these emissions and mountains of plastic, is threatening wild biodiversity. It's the biggest threat to life in its overall impact. So we really absolutely have to then talk in a much clearer, holistic way about the need to ensure that we're moving towards production on the land that is more diversified. We want to encourage the sort of small holding farm that traditionally kept generations, feeding themselves for thousands of years in many cases. Because, by the way, there's also been a big myth that the minute we started doing agriculture, everything went to hell. It's not true. There were many parts of the world where people were practicing agriculture for tens of thousands of years, including Aboriginal communities in Australia. And so what that entailed was a diversity, animals as well as grain or vegetables, and in mixed systems. Now, when you specialize and do monoculture, that's when you're starting to kill the soil, to kill and to create such unhealthy conditions for animals that it demands antibiotics and hormones, etc. For the plants, the monoculture is so unnatural that you then need chemical inputs, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. And it's when you go towards diversification that you're starting to heal the soil and heal the land, heal the plants to thrive. And in order to do that, we need to move away from this long distance market where when the farmer is being pressured by giant middlemen, the pressure is for standard products. The same one thing, tons of it. And not only the same thing, but the carrots have to fit the machinery for the harvesting, for the washing, for the supermarket shelves. So tons of food are being destroyed every year in this system. Perfectly healthy food being destroyed because it doesn't fit the machinery. Once you shorten the distance between the farm and the market, you start getting pressure for diversification. A local farmer's market doesn't want tons of just straight carrots. You're going to do better as a farmer if you can maybe grow some herbs as well. Maybe you have some fruit trees. You might even have some animals. And we have the great joy of having helped to start farmers markets around the world and actually have seen how farmers have benefited by diversifying, and how when they sell in the dominant global system, farmers generally get less than 10% of what we pay in the supermarket. In the farmers' markets, they often get 90% and certainly 80% in the more localized structures. So they're also doing much better economically, and The more they diversify, the better they do. The big issue that we need to be looking at is that labor is being made artificially expensive, because part of this systemic path towards scale, speed, competition, long distances, monoculture, it's all part of the same systemic madness. That is a path that's been enabled not only by governments, as I was saying earlier, subsidizing global business and global infrastructure, but all the time subsidizing technology to replace people. So whether it's the giant harvesting machines or the chemical sprays, ideally from airplanes, all of that is removing people who could be removing the weeds, who could be, dealing with the soil. So it's replacing people with technology, and that means lots of energy, lots of pollution. And we need urgently to raise awareness about shifting subsidies and shifting the mechanisms that governments use to encourage economic change. It's being shaped through a political choice to favor technology and energy over people. And that means we're locked right now into a situation where governments from left to right and even green parties are going along with a fundamental path of replacing people. That means destroying jobs while increasing pollution, especially climate emissions, but every other kind of pollution. Now, we need to also recognize that even the Green New Deal, as well as the language of regen agriculture, does not help us see this picture clearly. So with the Green New Deal, what's being framed is the idea that we're going to plaster the planet with solar panels. We're going to have these wind farms, miles of them, because we're going to fuel this global economy. We're going to fuel these giant corporations that employ fewer and fewer people and make fewer and fewer people richer and richer, while more and more people, even the middle classes, get poorer. Having said all that, I just quickly want to remind people that I carry a message that is not only a theoretical idea about localizing, but as World Localization Day shows, we are supporting and strengthening a practical movement that's demonstrating the opposite direction from the bottom up. And that is so inspiring, it's so heartening, and it shows us that it's not only possible to change things, but things are changing from the bottom up. What we feel a great sense of urgency about is how can we make this more visible? How can we get more people involved in supporting this movement practically at the community level, but also shouting from the rooftops so that we insist on policy change? I hope that makes sense.
That does make a lot of sense. I'm just I'm in awe really of your energy and all the things you're trying to achieve in this lifetime and the messages that you're trying to share and the way that you are doing that. I mean, it sounds like it's a big project. For obviously you've got some amazing people around you and some incredible people involved once again in World Localization Day, which is coming up this month, which is very exciting. Tell us, you've obviously wrapped up a lot of the themes there and the reasons why this is so important to you to implement localization rather than globalization and to focus on our local communities and to create that connection. I really loved what you said again in that other podcast about, you said that we've been pulled away into this prison of concept. We're bombarded by algorithms on social media, but who is shedding light on this need to come back home to the living world? And I think, that's exactly what this World Localization Day encapsulates. And we're really excited to be a part of that on Ibiza as well, and to actually, get people together to share local food and to sort of talk about all of the issues specifically I think that Ibiza is facing. And I know that you've got 20 events on 6 continents, which is quite an achievement.
There'll actually be many more events than that because it's a combination of some groups around the world. We're working with about 25 collaborators, groups of people, most of whom we know personally, and we have organized conferences with in the past, or they've translated our books and materials. And it's just very, very exciting to see how thirsty people are for this message, and also to see that, yes, we'll have at least sort of 50 events going on, and then many more local food feasts as well. And the big challenge is, how do you capture this, and how do you make it visible, and how can we help people to see that pattern of change, feel empowered, and want to do something in their local area, and also engage in that big picture activism. In other words, send out, our videos, send a message, not just about us, but some of these other things going on, in order to build up the momentum so that we demand policy change from government. In the meanwhile, what we're seeing is that as more and more things are changing at the grassroots level, the first avenue of policy change, the first level, is at the local level. So we are working with quite a few mayors and councillors in local councils, and even some regional governments. And so from the bottom up there too, we're seeing policy change happening. It's still, it's very significant, but we are, after COVID, also in the grip of the madness of what's being promoted at the top, which is this techno-economic path on steroids, speeded up. More and more people pulled apart, as we saw in The Social Dilemma. I hope people have seen that film about how the algorithms that are structurally linked to social media thrive on divisiveness and polarization. And we can see how desperate people are getting as they're pulled into these polar opposite camps, and there's almost no room for the middle ground. Now, the counter to that in the localization movement, which is happening also fairly quickly, and COVID has also strengthened it. And the counter to that is the face-to-face contact, is the truth that entrenched addictions, and that includes violence against women, it includes juvenile delinquents, it includes prisoners, it includes drug addicts, alcoholics, really people with entrenched addictions can be so helped, and really remarkably rapidly, by being guided towards collective, community, in-circle connection, human scale, face-to-face, sharing with others, a journey of change. And and I see these sort of circles emerging all over the world, and some of them are just, women's circles and men's circles, but also these sort of curated therapies, particularly with more entrenched addictions and so on. But I would argue that all of us now are in desperate need of coming together in those circles, face to face, to be open, vulnerable, and real, no longer playing the role that the dominant consumer culture has pushed us into, trying to appear perfect, trying to appear as though we don't need anybody, and we're so busy, we're so important, we're so rich, we're so beautiful, and we have all these things in place, and we feel completely empty because we are desperate for that deeper connection, for being appreciated for who we really are, with all our warts and problems and imperfections. Our need for one another is considered a flaw, a fault. No, we need one another, and that's how we evolved, and that's why we go around empty when we don't have that deeper connection. And it cannot be met through just a nuclear family. We need to create much deeper intergenerational bonds with people in our vicinity to build up a community fabric that really can help us regain our humanity, regain our joy, our health, our freedom to be truly unique, to be a genuinely individual and very, very special person. We're all special, unique. And the magic that happens as we come together in face-to-face, small-scale groups is that the magic is we're all unique and special, and yet because everyone is special, in a sense, no one is. It's a collective. It's a changing the I to a we.
Wow.
I mean, I hope I haven't said that too many times before on your program.
No, not at all. I mean, I don't think it can be said enough, essentially.
No.
I mean, all we've been doing in the last year or year and a half is, ordering things online because we can't go anywhere. We're not allowed, to do anything. And the segregation is at an all-time high. And I think, that actually, as you said, it fuels the insecurity of women and people on their own, and all of our humanness that we all kind of suffer from in our own various forms and ways, that we just by losing that connection, we become more paranoid and just basically falling into the traps of our demons and our traumas and things that have been bugging us all through these years. So it's exactly what you're saying now does feel like a really lovely moment. I think most of the world 80% or more is vaguely returning to some sort of form of normality for this sort of giant get together that you've curated. And I think it's it's really amazing, and the time feels very, very, very special, because I know that last year obviously World Localization Day was online. So tell us what you've actually got lined up for this event in June.
Well, there's working with collaborators in about 23, 24 countries, and many of them are putting on live events, but a lot of them also online events, partly because of COVID, but also because, for instance, our network in Japan, which consists of several organizations, including organizations I've worked with for many years to start building up a localization movement, and that includes the Global Eco-Village Network and people who've been working on local food and organic agriculture. And so a number of groups coming together to further strengthen the localization movement find that by doing an online conference, they are able to reach across the whole country. And so that, those kinds of things will be going on in Japanese, in Portuguese, in Brazil, and in Slovakia, and, all over the world. And then there are all these local food feasts that they are anything from people who are still in lockdown, having a meal made primarily from local ingredients, maybe having one of these Zoom dinners with someone on the other side of the world, but to really pay respect to where does the food come from? Can I make a meal that is primarily local? And can I share a discussion about the truth about the global food system being the most toxic, being the most important industry to shift? We've made a little video on the food system that people are also sharing in different languages. We have others like our partner, we have several partners in India, but one of them has a group called Bhumi, which includes a woman friend, Sita, who has started a college there. She also has a green school. They have a farm where people learn how to farm, and they have a retreat center also in the forest. And they combine this holistic approach to outer change and inner change, the deeper spiritual transformation, along with the outer practical one. And the practical one, again, central is that deep community building and that deep awakening to the amazing knowledge and wealth that comes from reconnecting to nature. And particularly when you do that around food, you almost overnight, you can start feeling a sense of being productive, of doing truly meaningful work that does transform people very quickly. But there's also this work going on in natural house building. We could have beautiful architecture across the entire planet if we weren't imprisoned in this system that pushes us towards supposedly cheap energy, supposedly cheap fossil fuels is what it still is. That has led to the cement and the plastic and taking us away from the ability to build in the local natural materials that in many parts of the world proved much safer in storms, in earthquakes, but we still have governments making it illegal to build in that way, and insisting on the concrete and steel and plastic. By the way, there are architects in Germany that have discovered that in fire, thick wooden beams are safer than steel. That in steel, in fires, the steel will melt, but those thick wooden beams last much longer. It is very interesting. But anyway, there's so much to talk about there, because if we were allowed to shift towards a world where the majority of people were allowed to focus on food, clothing, shelter, all the basic needs, primarily from the region, we would have a completely different world, and we would have a world that was vastly, vastly more productive and less polluting and more meaningful. So to come back to the program, you can see videos already of, for instance, Bhumi, I mentioned to you, what they're doing in India. And it's so heartening to see how these lenses of seeing the structural, systemic differences in the path going global, which means faster, more removed from nature, more specialized knowledge, more competitive, energy intensive, job destroying, and monoculture in terms of humans and nature. It means really that dominant economic path is anti-life. Life is diversity, every human being, every plant. So to take humanity in that direction it's criminal. It's as I say, it's deadly. The other direction, which is what localization represents, is this connection to the diversity, the restoration of the diversity, which is the foundational fact of life. And because it is foundational in restoring the individual, genuine diversity, as I said earlier, allowing people to be truly themselves, it's a path of deep spiritual and psychological healing at the same time as it's a path of creating meaningful jobs, meaningful livelihoods. And I forgot to say also that the global path is about more and more speed. The localizing path allows us to slow down to the speed of human beings and ecosystems. It both operates within those parameters of human needs and ecological needs. And we're talking about the plants and the animals. We're talking about that to care for, to nurture, whether it's a growing seedling or a young child or an animal or the aged. It takes time to care. It takes time to love. It takes time to feel that you are being loved for who you are, not what you look like, and not the title after your name or the car you drive. And so this scaling down, this slowing down, this recovery of the uniqueness, the authenticity of every moment of every individual is this profoundly healing path. And so when we help people to see the world through those two lenses and they choose the path towards genuine recovery and healing, it's so activating. It's energizing. And you'll see that if you watch some of the videos from our partners. I particularly love the one I just mentioned, Sita from Bhumi. There's Patricia from Mexico describing what's going on in Mexico, and with a lovely video also showing some of the visuals of the two diverging paths in Mexico. There's these beautiful women in Brazil who are working with us, and we're starting an eco university there, and very much with this framing. Here in Byron, where I am, we're going to be having wonderful celebrations. I'm doing a conference with two Aboriginal women and a woman who's a lawyer here who has started a new economy network of Australia, very much focusing on this localizing path. We'll have amazing community gatherings and food feasts where also, again, quite often Indigenous people here coming together with localists to support this localization movement with a central focus on food.
I mean, obviously you've talked about the kind of, localization themes and why it's so important, but, for you personally, like what was the main actual driver to create, what was that moment when you decided to go on this epic journey?
Well, the trigger was definitely finding myself in Ladakh or Little Tibet, a part of the world that hadn't been colonized and that hadn't been developed. So I had this amazing privilege of learning to speak the language fluently, of this group of people who actually are part of Tibet, but it's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India, high up on the Tibetan plateau, in a high altitude desert, living at about 12,000 feet, with very scarce resources. But because they've been allowed to adapt to that scarcity and to those resources, they had actually a very high standard of living. Of course, not the comforts that we have, but there was no real poverty, and there was no such thing as unemployment. And I encountered the most radiantly happy and equanimous people I'd ever met, fell in love with them. And so I had come out as part of the film team. I was going to help pick up a bit of the language and then help with the making of this film, this documentary about this lost world that had been closed off from the outside world until the mid-70s. And because I fell in love with them, I decided to stay on to work on the language. And I did a dictionary with local monks writing down the spoken language for the first time. And in the process of all that, I just fell more and more in love with these people and could see that in the name of progress, in the name of growth, unemployment and poverty was being created, and along with it, massive pollution. So I had this major wake up, and I read a book called Small is Beautiful, which I very strongly recommend. It was a German economist who actually had his wake up in Burma, very similar situation to what I encountered in Ladakh, and later on in Bhutan, where I worked over a 5-year period. In Burma, in the late 60s, I think it was, Schumacher discovered a society that essentially didn't know unemployment and poverty and started questioning the dominant economic thinking. So I was influenced by that book, and I started projects to demonstrate solar energy as an alternative to fossil fuels. And so don't get me wrong, I certainly believe in a Green New Deal, but it's not in the mainstream big Green Deal that's being pushed. There is a Green New Deal, which is about that respect for diversity in place, and which would allow us to slow down and would allow us to support a multitude of businesses, and above all, to support healthy farming, forestry, and fishery as a priority. And so that's the trigger for me, was seeing that in a completely traditional, ancient, indigenous culture, how well people could live, and realizing that with minimal input of outside resources, there could be greater comfort. It was almost like, we can have our cake and eat it too, if we don't destroy the more decentralized, localized structures, allow for more small towns and start shifting towards smaller cities instead of what's happening now in the dominant trend, which is to push us all into bigger and bigger mega cities. But instead, we will start a journey of supporting meaningful job creation and so on in smaller cities, and have a type of decentralization. We could have our cake and eat it too. And we more or less demonstrated that in Ladakh, that with solar heating, small-scale hydro, the energy that we would need for greater comfort and, heating in the winter and some forms of cooling in the summer and so on, can all be done in much more natural, gentle ways.
How is the localization of Byron Bay, where you live at the moment?
Well, I imagine it's a bit like Ibiza. I mean, we're having a problem here that super wealthy people from big cities are pouring in, and they're pushing out the local people, many of whom had chosen to live a more relaxed, a more simple life. They'd chosen that over high, goals and careers and, sort of normal path to success. And so many of them are being pushed out, and there's a counter push. There's a strong community spirit. There's a lot happening in the way of particularly local food, but generally localization. People have come together to try to fund a different path. But you see both of the directions at the same time. And I myself am often torn between putting more of my energy into just focusing on Byron right here where I am. And many people might think as a localist that that's what I'm recommending, but I'm not. I'm urging everyone to do that, but also help to get the word out, spread the word, and the word including knowledge about examples of successful localization. And I'm so happy that in trying to get this vision out, as well as these examples of what's going on, to celebrate and make visible and strengthening the localization movement, the worldwide movement. It's been wonderful that Russell Brand has been a great ally and friend, and to have had, the blessing of the Dalai Lama, whom I had many meetings with in the past, and he'd done a foreword to my book, Ancient Futures, and Noam Chomsky. These are two quite different figures, but both of them well known. I studied the Noam, and he's come out in support of our effort. And Brian Eno, he sent us a message last year. He's just sent another one. And Naomi Klein, also, who's a well-known voice in the climate movement. And she now has become very strong in warning people that if we don't focus on the economy, we're just not going to get anywhere. We're going to end up with a swing to the right that's very frightening. So I'm really, really happy to see how many people on the left in particular who were not supportive of localization have now come around very, very rapidly in the last few years.
Well, we're very excited to be supporting you here in Ibiza. I think there's a local food feast happening on the island locally, and we're also hosting a farmer's feast up at the Gang of Witches art residence. So I'm very much looking forward to doing that and supporting everything that all of your work. And yeah, I'm just listening to all of the stuff you've got lined up there. I'm not quite sure, when you ever get time to have any relaxation.
Well, I do almost every day. I walk by the sea here, and it's as divine. Well, actually, I have to say it's more divine than in Ibiza. If we have to compete over the sea and beaches, it's just unbelievably beautiful. And there's this walk not far from where I live, where you go up above, and from the headland, you look down over the sea. And it's just the most inspiring spectacle, every day different, the color different. You see dolphins most days. And so that's my church and my spiritual rejuvenation every day. And then I have a women's circle that also nourishes me hugely. And then regular singing groups also. That's another thing I really recommend from having lived in indigenous culture, is that people sang, danced, and make music together. It wasn't a question of being a star and a spectator, but it was, this participatory culture that's so much more fun.
Well, hopefully lots of people will participate in your event and get involved in the local food feast. I think it's still not too late. If anybody was interested in creating one of those, then get in touch with the Local Futures group and their online presence. Thank you, Helena, so much for joining us on the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast.
Thank you so much. I love what you're doing.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Joe Yule. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Calling upon My witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere, my brothers everywhere. The time has come to gather.